Welcome to Chants and Rants.
Hello.
Today I'm joined by a very special person, my sister, Nina Rose.
It's nice to meet everybody.
Not to be confused with my wife, Julia. I get some mail that say, thank you so much, you and Nina are a beautiful couple, because people assume that my wife is singing on the podcast, but it's actually my sister. Nina, yours truly here.
Yes, and it's good to finally clear that all up, and it's good to be here, so thanks, Paul, for having me.
Of course. And Nina, of course, stands for Antonina, which is her birth name. Beautiful Italian name meaning Little Anthony, female edition.
Yes, in Italian.
In Italian.
Little female Italian Anthony.
Little Lady Anthony has joined us on the pod. Today we're going to just touch base with Nina about how her Schola is going and discuss what the challenges have been. My dear sister has been volunteering for how long?
As a Schola director for about 6 months, and as a cantor in general for about 2 years at my home parish.
Excellent. So 2 years of cantoring. How did you get into cantoring? How did you first volunteer?
That's a great question. So I got into cantoring in a kind of slow and steady way. So way back when I was in high school, I would occasionally join the choir at the youth mass at one of my friends' parishes, and that was my first time singing in church, at least as a Catholic. And that was very much what you would expect from a modern American 5:30 p.m. on Sunday youth mass. We had the full band, we sang kind of songs that you would sway to or snap to or clap to. I hadn't really heard sacred music as it is intended to be. So I did a little bit through that. I stopped singing in mass basically all throughout college and for the post-COVID years. I graduated in 2020. For the first couple of years after that, there wasn't really an opportunity to be singing at church very much. And then I just got asked to do it here and there for different occasions. So I got asked to sing for a couple weddings, and I think that might have been my first cantoring experience, was cantoring for a wedding. And finally, I was asked to take over a cantoring position for a specific Sunday Mass at my parish.
And how did they know that you could sing, or how did it come about that your name entered the ecosystem?
Yeah, it's actually a funny story. I didn't know this until recently, but there was another cantor. He was singing the 8 a.m. Sunday Mass at my parish. My parish has I think we have 10 Sunday Masses. It's a very big church. And the 8 a.m. Sunday Mass was specifically dedicated to singing chant in the Novus Ordo Mass. So as the Novus Ordo Mass, I think, was intended. And it was the only Sunday Mass that did that at that parish. And he was moving away, so he asked around, and I think one of the priests at the parish actually texted in, because the priest knew my family, and said, Nina can sing, you should reach out to her. So this cantor reached out to me and asked if I would come for just the following Sunday to join him to sing. And I, at the time, this was a couple of years ago, I was very hesitant to make any commitments to anything. So I told him, I'm happy to come for this Sunday, but I am not interested in cantoring on a regular basis. And then he said, it's funny you say that, because I'm actually moving away. This is my last Sunday. I need someone to take over for me. So we had both very different expectations and needs. And I actually ended up, from that moment onward, cantoring, I think, every other week for the next year or so before taking on a bigger role.
Great. How did Calvin know that you could sing? Why did Calvin ask you to join him at this Mass?
Calvin asked me because Father Jonathan, who is a priest at our parish, knew my family, and I think probably knew Sing the Hours. Maybe he'd heard me sing. I think I was singing 2 years ago. Was I singing on the podcast at all? Possibly. Yeah, so that was the extent of my cantoring.
Okay.
It's funny because at that time I knew nothing about chant in Mass. I had very little cantoring experience, and I was also not a very willing soul, but somehow I got pulled into the world, and I'm very glad I did, because it actually awoke a whole new passion for me and an understanding of how the Mass should be and sound.
So at the beginning, you were a reluctant volunteer,
Very reluctant.
and you were
yes.
voluntold to do this Mass.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. And the Mass was already a Mass in which they had sought to incorporate some of the official solemn music of our Mass.
Yes. So how much does our audience know about the musical recommendations for Mass and the instructions?
We've talked about things like the Graduale Romanum quite a bit. We've talked about the proper chants. We've talked about antiphons. From my experience, though, it took a while. When I was first learning about sacred music, it took a while for these things to click. So a refresher is probably welcome if we want to go into the particulars of what is being sung. But let's get there in a little bit.
Okay.
So what tools did you use to learn? I guess this is a perfect segue. What tools did you learn or use to familiarize yourself with the music that they were expecting at this Mass, sort of the official music of the Roman Rite?
Yeah. So I have a secular music background. I trained in classical piano for all of my childhood, and then at UCLA I attended the music school for classical piano for 2 years, and they also made you do choir, and our parents had made us do choir for a long time. So I knew how to sing. Regular music, hymns. I knew how to sing modern songs, but I actually did not really know how to read chant, and so the first rehearsal that we did was actually very difficult for me.
Yeah.
I was messing up all over the place. It was very hard for my brain to switch into square notes and also into the 4-line staff, which square notes are written on, instead of the 5-line staff, which all modern music is written on.
So don't be discouraged if the first time you're exposed to traditional, proper Gregorian singing, if it's a little bit of a shock.
Yes, and even if you have zero music background, we'll get into this later, which several members of my Schola had no music background. You will learn it quite quickly. So we'll get into that more later. At the time, for me, it was difficult, even though I have a music background. But the more you do it, the more you get used to it. So now it's very easy for me to read square notes and that kind of music. And I had a helper, at least for that 1 week, who was Calvin, the former cantor.
So you went in your first rehearsal ever for one of these Masses, it was like a discouraging train wreck in terms of your ability to execute these chants, and now you can pretty much sight read chant?
Yes.
So over a 2-year process, at what point, how many months in, and understand Nina has a pretty solid music background, so this might not be the timeline that everybody experiences. How many months in do you think it started to click to where you could do it with ease?
Yeah. So I'll say within a couple, so at first I was practicing those chants, and we learned 3 different pieces of chant for each Mass. We would do the introit, which is the entrance, the offertory, and the communion. And for those first few months, I was practicing them. I would practice them at the weekly rehearsal. I would practice them for like an hour the day before, and then I would get up at like 6 a.m. and practice for another 45 minutes at least. And then I would go into the church half an hour early and we'd practice again. So I was practicing maybe 4 times.
That's a great deal of practice.
Yes, because I just did not feel confident that I could get it. Within like 6 months, I had kind of axed that Sunday morning, rush of practicing again. And then within another 6 months, I only had to practice, maybe once at the rehearsal and then once right before. Now I feel pretty confident that I can go over it once before and then just go and do it in the Mass without any problems. But that was definitely a process.
Okay, so the first time you got the idea to then do a Schola, because now the Schola sings at this Mass that you used to solo cantor at.
Mm-hmm.
You were solo cantoring solemn antiphons, which, by the way, just as a very brief summary, the solemn antiphons are the official prescribed music for the current Roman Rite. So whether you go to a parish in the suburbs or the city, a parish in Texas or in Italy or in France, there is a master book of the official entrance, psalm, alleluia, offertory, and communion that is prescribed for our worship in Mass. And many people, including many music directors, cantors, are ignorant of even the existence of such a book. The book is officially promulgated by the fathers of the Second Vatican Council, and it's also basically identical to the book before the Second Vatican Council. So this is both the current, modern, appropriate chants of the Roman Rite, but it also has a beautiful continuation from the chants that would have been heard in Italy in the 12th century or the 14th century. So, and to get an idea of what they sound like, we could just do Requiem Aeternam.
I don't know that much more.
So the Requiem, that's the entrance chant for a funeral mass. That's an example of what these chants might sound like. They're very beautiful. They're all in their standard form in Latin, although they can be transcribed beautifully into English by a willing hand and a willing heart. So that's what the mass that Nina was invited to sing was already doing at this particular mass. Okay, so when did you first get the idea that we can expand this to a school? Like, who volunteered, or what series of young adults volunteered? What did that look like for someone to come up and say, hey, I'd like to do what you're doing and join you in this project?
The first thing that happened, this was happened gradually over time, because again, I was voluntold to cantor, and so if you had also told me at that time, oh, you're also being trained to become a choir director and you're going to have to spend hours a week training other people how to sing, I would have said, oh, you're crazy, I'm out, so find someone else for your weekly mass. So this happened gradually, but the first instance of me starting to think, oh, it might be good to do a Schola, I was also voluntold to do a special occasion Schola/choir for the 8 a.m. Christmas Mass, and Paul actually joined me for that. So this was 2 Christmases ago. It was myself, Paul, Calvin, who was my cantor who voluntold me. He was back just for Christmas, and one other singer. So we did a little 4-part situation, and we sang Christmas Mass. And then that was great, but it was also, an extra time commitment. So I was like, we're not doing that. The next year, I was sort of voluntold again. And this time we had a bigger group. It was myself, Paul, Calvin, and then 3 others. So we had a group of 6 of us, 2 girls, 4 boys, 4 men. We did the Christmas Mass again. And at that point, the wheels started turning in my head of, this is something that I can do. I got some more experience directing. And this is something that is actually very worthwhile to do, because I think man is not meant to chant alone. And I had been chanting alone by myself for a year and a half prior at that Mass. And people would, occasionally come up and say, wow, that was so beautiful, the chanting, how do you do it? But it felt like it shouldn't be something that was just the one expert who chants and then everybody else listens. So after that was Christmas of 2023, I want to say. Yes, Christmas of 2023, so about 7 months ago. After that, the wheels started turning in earnest, and I asked my spiritual director, who is also the pastor of this parish, I asked him if we could potentially get a Schola going. And he basically just told me, wait, and let things come to you. Don't push for things, because I think in the running of parishes, there tends to be a lot of strong personalities that see the way things are done, see a way they want them to be done, and tend to start imposing their own will on how the parishes are run, and what for good or for evil. So for me, that could be me saying, I want to have, more sacred music at a parish, which is a good desire, but then there's also the danger of, starting to, bulldozing in, trying to wreck whatever the current situation is, and potentially hurting the peace or harming the peace. So my spiritual director said, wait. And eventually he, I think, spoke to the music director at that parish, and she was already interested, like God had kind of maybe given her the idea too. And so he said, you can start. And we got started in February of this past year.
And how many people were at your first Mass?
So
in the Schola?
First Mass, I think it was something like 8 singers maybe. Our first rehearsal was maybe 5 people, including myself. and it has grown a lot. So now we have about 20 members who are kind of rotating in and out, so around 12 singers at a given Mass. But it started very small.
12 singers is a healthy size, and they're all young adults?
All of them young adults, yeah.
Let me grab my questions. So, they're all young adults. What is the musical ability range of your singers?
Yeah. Okay. So when we started out, there was myself, who has a musical background at this point and comfortable with chant, and every single other person who was at that first rehearsal. I'm trying to make sure that I don't remember this incorrectly. I might be forgetting one person, but every person that I can remember who was at that first rehearsal could not even read music.
Yeah.
Zero musical background. One of them, I think, had sung for choirs before, but learned by ear exclusively. And every single other person was like, oh, I sing in the shower.
Yeah.
Some people were like, I don't even sing in the shower. I've never sung in my life. So that's how it started. I think as we got a little better, we attracted a couple other young adults in the community who were singing at other parishes maybe, or just hadn't been singing for a while because they hadn't quite found opportunities to sing in Masses that where they could sing and feel like they were singing the Mass as it was supposed to be sung. So maybe more traditional young adults. I don't know if that's the right word for it. But we started to attract people who had more of a musical background, and then that elevated the status of the choir further.
I think many people have found that if you do the proper music of the Roman Rite, you end up bringing a lot of people who have a longing for proper worship out of the woodwork. And
yes. Yeah.
Sort of, if you build it, they will come.
Yeah.
Feel the dreams sort of situation.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how has chant been received? Because your typical Schola member is not somebody who, like most people, has been exposed to the Roman gradual, the Graduale Romanum, or the Graduale Simplex, or even chant, or four bars, or square notes, or solemn antiphons. So how has you could say, style of the Roman Rite chant, how has that been received by your average Schola member?
Yeah, I think that well, first of all, I think it's been received really positively. I think it's been received as an awakening for a lot of my fellow Schola members. One of my Schola members, she told me, we were in Mass, we were at daily Mass together, because a lot of us also go to daily Mass at the parish. And the church is a very faithful church. The priests are extremely reverent. Everybody who runs the parish in the administration is very faithful and wants to bring the kingdom of heaven about on earth in a very authentic way, but are doing so kind of in the climate that they're in and with the resources that they have and the education they have. And so the music at the parish is something that, for up until the last couple years, for my entire Catholic journey, I thought was the traditional music, which now I understand is kind of like 1800s hymns, some of which are approved for liturgy, but some of which have not been approved for liturgy, and are. So it's not that they are doing the proper music of the Roman Rite. They are doing older, perhaps more established hymnody than more folk modern hymns. Yes. Yeah. However, that's still, in retrospect, that's still more of a decision of taste, with perhaps improved theology in these hymns in many cases. But we're talking, instead of on eagle's wings, they might be doing "Soul of my Savior, sanctify my breast," so like older turn of the 20th century, turn of the 19th century hymns. Yes, exactly. So that's what I had thought, and most of the people at my parish or in my Schola had thought was the traditional music. And so one of my Schola members, we were at daily Mass together, we had these hymns, and we were singing these hymns, and then afterwards she said, "Nina, you've kind of ruined Mass for me." And I hopefully haven't ruined Mass for her, but I think I have ruined the way, or I think the Schola and learning about chant has kind of given her this longing to see and to participate in the Mass in its fullness, which includes the liturgical aspect, the musical aspect.
I like the word awakening that you used, because it's not that, doing beautiful, proper music is supposed to ruin the Mass for anyone. It's that once you hear the act of worship that the Mass is, as it's supposed to sound, as it sounds properly, then it's difficult to accept anything less, even if it's a very, very good hymn, even if it satisfies certain aesthetic tastes or whatever. It's like, it's no longer a question of which hymn is best. It's why hymns.
Yes, exactly.
Or at least why hymns that are non-liturgical. And I love the thought that it's not about choosing music from a particular era or that has a particular taste. It's not about choosing old music or new music for Mass. It's about choosing eternal music for Mass. And what the Church says in the Catechism about sacred music, it says it is a treasury of inestimable value, greater than that of any other art. And it talks about in the Second Vatican Council how the Church has safeguarded this chant tradition, because it's part of our highest culture and our highest, most authentic form of beauty and worship mixed together. And that's why I think what's interesting about it is that it's the only music I've ever seen in Mass, period, that's capable of authentically firing up old people and young people. My 90-year-old Uncle Gino can hear Requiem Aeternam and think, wow, that is so prayerful and so beautiful. And then a toddler can hear Requiem Aeternam and think, wow, that is so beautiful. It's transcendent. It's not meant to speak to any microculture, like this is 70s culture, this is 80s culture.
It's also not the youth Mass that I grew up going to.
Right, which is something Nina and I have discussed, that like it's kind of a shame that not just, there's something wrong in the context of Catholic history if you can go to two parishes that are 2 miles from each other, and if you're a person who's not familiar really with the Mass and the parts that matter and the parts that don't matter, if you go to 2 different parishes and the music is entirely different on the same Sunday, then you might not understand intuitively or obviously that these people are even in the same religion, or that they're worshiping the same way. And that's a problem, and that's a unique thing in Catholic history that we're experiencing today in the sort of relativistic landscape of the now. But even at individual churches, you have a youth Mass, you have a Mass directed towards people who like traditional music, quote unquote, but like I said, this is like maybe the wrong question, traditional versus modern. How about eternal? And then you have people that are, this is our praise and worship Mass, whatever that means. It's more of a Protestant co-opting, even in terms of the language. And what you do when you do that is that you granularize and you individualize the faith when it's supposed to be. And I live in a multi-generational household. On the first floor, I got my 90-year-old Uncle Gino, as I mentioned, and then we have my 0-year-old daughter. And I think that true lasting culture and faith, and you want the faith to be stable. You want to pass along to your children, right, that which you believe and that which you profess. And that's part of the Catholicity, is it's throughout the ages. And it's a good Mass, a good even social event, that's an antidote to modern siloing of people into various special interest groups, which pits generations against each other. Our generation, I think, is more contempt than any ever for older generations. Like we talk about the boomers, and that always exists. There's a human instinct, but the antidote to that instinct is a universal experience of culture, which you can find in the Mass, in worshiping the living God, who is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. If he's the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, then why does he sound different at 9 a.m., 12 a.m., and 5 p.m.?
And I think that's because there's an overemphasis on liturgy serving the people rather than liturgy being a tool for the people to serve God. And that has been, I think, my experience a lot, like at these youth Masses and in a lot of churches. But I think where my parish, even without the the Latin propers and without the graduale Romanum and without really understanding the liturgy, they've been trying to kind of rediscover liturgy as a tool to serve God, which is why they're going to the more traditional hymns and the kind of older music. But there actually is a much easier way, which is not necessarily the litmus test of this hymn has to be 200 years old, but there's actually timeless music and a timeless way to serve God, which is through these Latin.
Literally timeless, because there's no rhythm in chant.
Yes.
So how do you, just as a brief aside, how do you accommodate for keeping your Schola together with 18 singers who don't have a lot of experience to this culture of chant, this culture of worship?
Yeah.
How do you keep them together in sync when there's no rhythm?
Yeah, and actually I would say it might even be easier with chant than it is with kind of secularized church music. One of my friends was telling me a story where he kind of would split time between the Schola and another parish church, and he was saying that he arrived at Sunday Mass at this other church to sing, and the music director wasn't there that week, and there was a miscommunication. The choir members didn't know, and so to keep time with the hymns that they were singing, some of the people in the choir started snapping, and were like doing this thing, so they all stayed in unison, which is, at least in my understanding of the Mass, isn't a really appropriate way to sing the music of the Mass.
No.
Well, and they probably were going extra slow because of that. It probably dragged more. Their snaps probably weren't even total sync, because it takes a lot more discipline to do rhythm well. Like, think about the insane precision it takes for even the drummer of, like, I mean, of course, in like heavy metal music, the drumming has to be so laser. But even like a casual band, it is no easy thing to keep time being a drummer. Time is a difficult thing.
Keeping time and rhythm is either something that is unnatural, that requires that metronome-like precision, which I, as a pianist, practicing with the metronome was the worst part of my day. And it was an hour of my day at least, which is very painful to do. Or it's something that is very carnal, like kind of like the sway, like what gets you moving, and that is also not appropriate for Mass. So I actually find that staying together is a lot easier than people may think, because in chant, there's each note or each neum will receive one beat, right? So it's all it's all divided into one beat, and if you can agree as a choir on what that one beat is, everything is very easy to get into sync. And then number two, chant, rather than being metrical, having those measures with the 4 beats and the syncopation, which we find in a lot of modern music, instead we rely on the breath. So a phrase will be what you can sing together in a breath, and then everybody breathes together, and then we begin the next phrase. And what I found is that for small groups, for subsections of my Schola where it's just those who have been singing chant for a while, I don't even direct. I don't move my hand. We just stand in a little semicircle, we sing, we all sing in perfect sync because we don't need to.
Which is kind of it's almost a miraculous thing. It's a very transcendent experience to, without any imposition, you could say carnal imposition of like a drum beat or somebody, forcing you, just the breath of prayer, the speech level nature of chant, that you could sing it fast or slow. Although, tell me about singing Mass parts. So let's actually, and we should wrap this up soon, but what are some challenges, architecturally, challenges in terms of...
There's the obvious challenge, which is that of experience. And that is something that has gotten easier and easier as time has gone by, which the first Mass that my Schola did was rough. We did not execute perfectly. And we still, every Sunday we'll have maybe at one moment that, we get a little off or something. That's natural. That's gotten a lot better over time. I would say in terms of outside factors, I think that the church as a whole, at least maybe in just America, I can't really speak for the rest of the world, has lost the plot when it comes to implementing music in the liturgy over the past almost 100 years, maybe 70 years has been the worst, but I think it's been kind of a process for longer than that. So for example, in my church, there are no acoustics. So the sound where we sing is just dead. And I think it's designed for a singer to sing into a microphone and for that sound to be amplified without any echo.
So by no acoustics means there's no reverberation of the space. There's no continuation of sound from the source.
Yeah. So as a 12-year-old, I would have understood that as echo or reverb. Yeah. So, and it's true that if you are not really like trained with the echo, I think I've been in some churches that are big and vast, and the voice and the microphone, but also with the echo, it comes out very garbled. You can't really understand what's going on. But these large churches with those spaces have been designed for singing chant. And when you sing chant in those spaces, unamplified, no microphones, it is a very, very beautiful experience. Yeah. So my Schola is very, very green. We started in February. It's now July. In May, I think is when Pentecost was, right? In May, we were invited to sing at a monastery, a Carmelite monastery, for their Pentecost Vigil Mass. So a small subset of us, 8 of us, went and sang this Mass, and it was in one of those churches that has, it's domed, there are no microphones, it's constructive stone, so there's this reverb. And we came out of that Mass thinking, man, we are so good. We sounded so good. Yeah. And people were coming up to us like, that was the most beautiful thing. I felt like I was in heaven. And then we sang the same exact thing the next morning, and it was a completely different effect because the space does not serve liturgical practice.
That unveils the eternity a little bit more, and even the echo is perhaps a sign of the angels and saints joining in, and how all mistakes are kind of covered over by good reverb, whereas if it's a totally dead space and somebody's even a little off, or their timing, quote unquote,
amplifies issues.
It amplifies issues.
It amplifies individuality as well, rather than communal prayer.
Yeah.
So if one person makes a mistake, you can hear it, rather than it's swallowed in the vastness of the worship.
Yeah. Yeah, and then also the sacredness of the space kind of elevates your offering of sound, like just that we bless each other with holy water. When the space then is involved, these sacred walls that have relics built into them and consecrated, and when a church is dedicated, there's a whole liturgy for it. And when the space then is part of the worship, there's a beautiful 4-dimensionality to the heavens and the earth meeting. So what would you say to somebody who is thinking, I want to incorporate more reverent music or more sacred music, or I want to start a Schola, or how do I even begin this process? What are 3 tips that you would give to somebody who wants to get their parish more involved with the music of the Roman Rite?
I guess my advice differs based on how friendly your specific church is towards that movement, towards more liturgical music and more traditional music. If your church is relatively friendly, as mine is, I think, number 1, if you can start with a small group and it will grow naturally. I did some recruiting at the very beginning, a couple people joined, but after that, I remember being at a young adult gathering, and one of my friends who was in the Schola, I didn't even say anything to this other group, but he was just singing the praises of the Schola. He's like, I couldn't even sing notes, and now I'm singing chant, and he was going on this rant, and he actually recruited several people in that moment, and the Schola grew by 2 or 3 people right then and there. So it will grow. So start small and just invest some time and make that commitment for a season at least. My Schola started as just the Lenten season Schola, so I wasn't asking people to commit for long term. I was just saying, can you commit for 6 weeks? And almost everybody wanted to commit for Easter season and then ordinary time. So start small, even if it's small commitment. Number 2, I'm sure you've talked about this on the podcast, but take advantage of the graduale simplex. So the prescribed music for the Roman Rite can be found in the Graduale Romanum, which gets the pride of place for music and liturgy. But there's also another book that was released a few years later, I want to say.
The Graduale Simplex, basically the same year, maybe even first.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Graduale Simplex.
The Graduale Simplex. And what it does is it takes It takes from the simpler chants in the Graduale Romanum, as well as some chants in
The various like liturgy of the hours books throughout the centuries.
Yeah, and it compiles them into a set of masses that you can sing for different occasions and simpler chants. And so my Schola, once it got big, and that was more time during Eastertide, I started realizing we need to maybe go to the lower common denominator and learn easier stuff that maybe the more advanced members of the Schola will think is too easy. But we spent a couple months doing almost exclusively Graduale simplex music, and then occasionally a couple people would sing the more complicated antiphons by themselves. A couple weeks ago was our first week that the entire Schola sang every antiphon from the Graduale Romanum.
Wow.
Just because if you start with the simpler stuff, you get better as a choir singing together, you get better singing on pitch, which was something we struggled with at the beginning because we were very inexperienced as a choir. And you also recognize the patterns in Gregorian chant, which chant has tons of patterns, like da 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 da.
And there's actually, I forget there's an exact number of how many individual motifs exist in chant, and it's only, if memory serves, something like 270.
Yeah.
So there's only 270 very familiar bits of shapes that are very repetitive. And you might think 270 is a lot, but even those 270 all fall just in 8 different modes. So it is something that ends up becoming very very familiar.
Yes. So even some of my Schola members who had no experience were saying, they're saying, Nina, like these, why are you picking easier chants for us now? Like these chants are so much easier than the ones we did when we first started. And I was like, these are not easier chants we're doing from the Graduale Romanum. If anything, they're harder now, but you have gotten better at recognizing patterns. You see this and you think, oh, that's this pattern, I can sing that easily. So to recap, use the Graduale simplex, start small, and
You didn't give a third.
Oh, I didn't give a third. Start small with a group, start small with a commitment time frame, and use the Graduale simplex.
And when you use the Graduale simplex, if you're worried about doing it in the vernacular, there are many tools that exist, like Simple English Propers, Adam Bartlett. There's a lot of people who have taken either the full chants from the Graduale Romanum or the Graduale simplex, or some combination, and created simple English chants that are in proper Gregorian chant and are based on the universal forms of the Roman Rite.
Yes.
There are lots of free PDFs online of simple proverbs. I think Richard Rice did one. And what we often do, like when I am working with my Schola, is I'll take Graduale simplex chants and I'll take the official translation from the Abbey Psalms and Canticles, which has been approved for worship by the USCCB. Lots of jargon I just spat out. If you don't understand anything I just said, don't worry. But you can take official English texts and transcribe them yourself even, or you can email Sing the Hours and maybe we have one already transcribed for you. There's only a fixed set in the Graduale simplex. And my encouragement as a final note would be, don't do half measures. You don't need to do a multi-year process of baby stepping people, because this music was able to be sung by peasants in the 8th century who had no musical training. And we in the modern world, most people have some guitar lessons when they were kids, or piano lessons, or did some singing, or were in musical theater. The amount of musical exposure we have would be like the sons of lords and ladies. Like we'd all be sons of and daughters of Charlemagne with the amount of musical training we have. And it is something that you end up kind of learning the language very quickly. And I think part of that is spiritual, because the Holy Spirit says, I'm going to teach you how to pray. And this is prayer. This is the way the church has always decided to pray. The one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. They pray through chant and through breath and through singing together.
You don't need to find experts.
You don't need to be an expert. You don't need to find experts, but you also don't need to do half measures where I'm going to start baby stepping myself. Because when you baby step yourself, you end up never getting quite to the exultant, beautiful music. And it's really, really high form, which is more attractive, and actually will get more people joining, as Nina's been describing. But also, you end up ending with what you start with. So if you start with like making a lot of concessions, a lot of half measures, that will end up where it arrives, and you won't really find yourself progressing much past that. an example of what Nina recommended, which is awesome, back to her step 3 of the graduale simplex, is that's not a half measure. That is fully legitimate, lawful music in the Roman Rite, but super simple. And that is a really beautiful thing. By half measures, I mean like, okay, we're going to sing the antiphon once, but then we're going to do a hymn to get people
participating.
To get people participating,
Make them more comfortable.
to make the audience more comfortable.
Yeah.
The audience will be comfortable eventually because this is the authentic music that is their baptismal birthright, and it's perfectly designed for the Mass. It grew up with the Mass. It's the most solid part of the Mass in terms of unchanging. Like, that's why the chants today are not different from the chants of the traditional Latin Mass. It's like it is the music for all. It's the music for 90-year-old Uncle Gino, and you don't need to worry, are the youth going to be down with this? Because the youth have been singing that since the 8th century, like across a million cultural variations and a million different global cultures. And it's like you have to accept that the lawful, the standard, the approved ways are best, and they also are universal because they're not going to appeal to, oh, well, I miss my music from the 80s, or I miss my music from the 2010s, and there's no trends in it. And I promise you that if you do it gently, if you do it, as Nina said, don't go bulldozing. That's a good lesson from earlier on. But if you do it just out of a love for Christ, and you do it out of a place of trying to get the whole body politic to be able to worship together, which is the most authentic way to do it, then it's going to be great. But you don't need to take half measures. Yeah. And Nina, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast and chatting about this, and I hope you guys have learned something about Scholas, about Nina. You can join us at our Boston retreat in 2.5 weeks. Nina and I will be teaming up to work on implementing the Liturgy of the Hours specifically. If you don't listen to Sing the Hours, you can tune in anytime to join us for morning prayer and evening prayer. And that's going to be a really fruitful weekend where we're going to look at July 26th to 28th, 2024. We're going to look at, in Boston, how to incorporate singing the Liturgy of the Hours into your parish and how to do it well and in your family life. And that is a great place to start. If you run into problems, if people are resistant to change and attached to a certain culture at your Mass, I mean, it's a blank slate with the Liturgy of the Hours. So incorporating the worship of God in that beautiful, worthy liturgy that is the Liturgy of the Hours, you're not going to find any resistance to just doing it the way that it should be done, because it's a blank slate. So come to our retreat, and we will worship God together, sing together, and you can experience what it's like to chant. Thanks, Nina.
Thank you, Paul.
God bless everybody.